If you're anything like me, you've probably been holding off taking a good look at the Common Data Service. You could be forgiven for that because up until this point you haven't really needed the Common Data Service to build applications in Power Apps. Microsoft is rolling out some fantastic features in the CDS and you can use those and leverage those features in your own Power Apps. The thing is, you're kind of selling yourself short if you don't take a look at the CDS and what it has to offer for your Power Apps development. In this episode, we're going to take a beginner's look on how you can use the CDS in your Power Apps application and leverage some of those awesome features. Before we dive in, I'd just like to say a quick sorry to Microsoft for taking so long to take a look at the Common Data Service. It has really been an eye-opener.
Apology accepted, dear boy.
Okay, let's jump right into today's video.
So I've got make.powerapps.com website open, and this is the Power Apps development environment that we're all familiar with at this point. On the left-hand side, we've got all of our usual menus, and the one we're actually interested in today is the data menu. Now, this is where we access the CDS and configure our tables and everything else that we need to build CDS. We'll build Power Apps that will use CDS entities. Now, I'm doing like little finger quotes at the moment. You can't see them, but Power Apps, just to touch on this quickly, Power Apps calls the effectively what we know as tables, or I guess records, or even sort of more familiar more familiar SharePoint lists. This in the CDS, they're actually called entities. Now, if you're sort of familiar with database stuff, even though we call them tables in SQL, we also sort of refer to them as entities, especially when we're doing things like entity diagrams. But again, we don't really need to worry about any of this stuff. We just need to know that entities in the CDS are actually tables or lists, and we can use entities where we can create our own entities for our Power Apps applications, which we can then share across multiple Power Apps applications, and of course save data and load back data out of, exactly what we do with SharePoint. Now, we're only going to really be delving into that sort of side of things in this particular video because I really just want to give you a beginner's sort of look into this. But one thing to note that with the CDS, we get a whole ton of more features that we don't get with SharePoint lists, and can be a little bit clunky as well with using things like SQL data. Are actually pretty easy to do in the CDS, and as you start using CDS more, you'll realize that this stuff is just really designed to build apps around, and that's sort of how Microsoft have built it, and just everything that you've been wanting out of a data model, you're gonna get out of the CDS, which is really, really good. Okay, so let's dive right in. If we expand data and we take a look here, like I mentioned, right off the top of this menu, we can see entities. Now, that's what we're really interested in. We've got a whole heap of other menus here, but we're not going to take a look at any of that because we really don't need them at this point. All we need is entities. So let's click on that. And this is really just a default installation. I didn't create any of these. So this is what you'll probably be looking at when you first generate or when you first go into the CDS, unless of course you're working in a company that people are already building applications in the Common Data Service. But if not, you'll probably have something like this straight out of the box. Now, you can pretty much ignore all of this. They're just default entities that Microsoft are giving you, because it feels like you might need them, or like, it's a standard group of entities that a company may or may not use. Each one of these, like I said, each one of these entities is effectively a table or a list, and in there you're expected to store data around whatever entity it is. For example, email, or maybe email's not such a good one, but organization, phone call, position privilege. Yeah. So anyway, we can just ignore all of that because today's video, we're really going to focus on building our own entity and showing you how to sort of interface in with that. So this part's really, really easy. All we need to do is just click on new entity. And in here, this little box pops out and we've got a display name. We've got the plural display name. And then what happens here, Microsoft basically generates a name, a unique name based off that. And then we've got the primary name field. And so this primary name field is effectively like, your primary key. It's something that will just be default created in your list, and something you don't need to even use when you're building your application. But as an old school sort of database SharePoint list guy, I usually like using my own ID field that just has. So let's just create a new entity, and let's call this, or let's create a list around, call it team leave. And what we're just going to use this for is to, so the team members can log their on leave time. So if they've got some holidays planned or whatever, they can just put an entry into the app, which will save this into our entity or our list that we're creating now. One little gotcha before we move on. Notice here that when I type leave, what what the CDS tries to do here, it actually tries to pluralize, and I'm not sure exactly why it does this, but this caught me out actually. So if I say put something like Chino entity, see what happens here? It pluralizes, then it gets it right. Like it changes Chino entity to Chino entities. And when I first created one of these, I went looking for Chino entity, and all I could see was Chino entities in the available entities list. So that's just something to pay attention to. So anyway, I'm going to call this team leave, and I'll just make the plural name the same as the display name. You can see here the name, the unique name is called CRD96 underscore. So that's just like the system name. We don't need to worry about that. And in here, it's created a field, primary name field, and we can just leave that as name. Why not? We don't want attachments for this particular list, but you could actually add the functionality to save attachments to it as well, but let's leave that. Under more settings, we've got some other stuff here that we can set up, but we don't really want them right now. We're not concerned because what we're doing now is going to be more than enough for what we need for our application. So let's just click done. Now you can see we've come back to our entity screen here, or our creation screen, but up here we've got like a little highlighted area that's saying provisioning your entity in the background. You may continue making changes. So like this is happily spinning this entity up in the background. So we might just wait until that is done. Hopefully that won't take too long. There we go. Your entity team lead has been provisioned successfully. Awesome. All right, so we can see here are all the fields. We're looking at team lead, which is the list or the entity I just created. But like I said, think of this as a SharePoint list. When you create a SharePoint list or a custom list in SharePoint, and you might just say, I just want the default title field, and you don't create any other fields. You still get a few other fields when you do that, things like modified, modified by, and created by. So this is the same thing that's happening here. SharePoint creates those columns for you, and so does CDS. So it gives you a whole heap of default columns that you may or may not need in your entity. Now, some of these are quite useful. Some of them we probably won't need right now, like status, reason, time zone rule version number. These columns we just won't use, so we can just ignore them. But columns like modified on, modified by, created on, created by, we may very well use and will be useful because they'll just be automatically populated when we create a record, which is exactly how it works in SharePoint. Fantastic. Exactly what we're after. So there are all the fields, these submenus here. We can see these are all the fields we've got. If we want more fields, we can create them here, which we probably will in a second. But if I just quickly move across, I can go through what other sort of configurations we can do to this particular entity. So under here, we can define relationships. So if you're a database guy and you work with sort of data models and building databases up, or as an application developer, you may also delve into building your sort of data model and your tables that support your application. I know I have had to do that on many occasions, like write stored procs and that kind of stuff. So I need to understand how the data hangs together. A lot of the time, you don't want to just build flat, big flat tables. You want to build sort of relational databases. And in here, we can do exactly the same thing. We can define how this entity relates to other entities. And in particular, how fields within this entity will relate to other entities. And that's done through, just like with SQL tables. Can't do this so much in SharePoint lists. So this is one thing that definitely elevates the CDS over using SharePoint lists and gives you a lot more features as far as creating sort of relational databases and relational relational tables and data that relates to each other. And we do that through lookup columns as well inside of our entity. So yeah, that's a really good way to do that, like on its own sort of screen, to configure that up. Today, we're not really going to worry about that so much, but again, pretty easy. So feel free to dive in and play around with that. Next one is business rules. So business rules is really cool as well. Like most of the time when you're creating sort of SharePoint lists, when you're creating a SharePoint list for an application or like a Power App, or like you're creating a SQL table for a Power App again. Let's sort of talk Power App terms here. That most of the time you will roll, nearly always, you will roll those business rules inside of your application. Things like, when this field is blank, this field must be blank, or when this field equals this value, that field must also be equal that value, or, those kind of rules. We'll sort of roll that inside of our application. Now, in the CDS, this actually allows us to define business rules at our data model level. So this is really good for sort of keeping a more strict control of what data goes into your database, and that whole rule of junk in, junk out. This will help you maintain a healthy set of data inside of your database. So yeah, by defining rules at the database level, you're effectively stopping sort of other, like, people circumventing your app and inserting data into your table, or making changes to your data that aren't really valid from a business point of view. So again, that's really all I'm going to say on that. Feel free to do your own research, take a look further into business rules. Probably maybe something, if this video is really successful and people are really interested in CDS, probably something I will dive in on a future video, but definitely feel free to take a look and play around with that. Pretty simple to set those rules up. Now, views, on the other hand, we're definitely going to take a look at today. So views are, I see, as really just a 101 thing as far as working with the CDS and working with entities. But this will allow us, just in a very similar sort of way that we do with SharePoint and with SQL, we can define rules at our table level. Sorry, we can define views at our table level, where what we're doing is we can define filters and sort of column what we want to see as far as what columns are displayed and what data is displayed. We can define that at our entity level, and unlike with SharePoint lists, we can't actually, with SharePoint lists, we can't access those views from Power Apps. So we have to do all those sort of filters and logic to filter, say, a gallery, for example. We have to do that in Power Apps. And you've probably done that hundreds of times with working with Power Apps, so you know exactly what I mean. But here with the CDS, we can define those views at the CDS level, at the entity level. So now we can define a whole set of rules, and all we do then is just we call that view when we're accessing our data in our when we're configuring our gallery or configuring our data connection in Power Apps. So it's a far more elegant solution than, I've always been a fan of trying to take as much logic out of the application as possible. So when I build Power Apps or applications that use a SQL backend, I always try to use as much sort of SQL logic as I can. So I always go for building stored procs whenever I can, or using SQL views whenever I can, rather than sort of filtering at an application level. So this is where this idea comes in. We're going to define these views and define these slices of our data in our entity rather than at our application level, and that way they're reusable as well, which is fantastic. Really great way to build an application, and a really sort of a good approach for application development. Makes a lot of sense. Anyway, moving on. So the next options here, the next 4, we don't really use building sort of standard Power Apps. These are more for model-driven apps. We don't really use these when we're just building standard sort of Canvas Power Apps. So therefore, they're not really something that I've delved into or used much. But again, if we're building applications using model-driven apps, this is where we're defining our model, how our model is rendered inside of our application, where our forms, our dashboards, our charts, etc. Keys is something sort of like this primary key definition, but again, not really something that's very useful just in Canvas apps, and not something that you would use so much in your application. But that said, feel free to explore these further, and if you can use them, definitely go ahead and do that. I think particularly if you're building model-driven apps, this is something you would be delving into way more. The last menu item on our list here is just data. So this is where we're doing like our select statement on our data, and we're bringing back what data is contained in our entity. Because we've just created this, there's no records in there. So if we're creating an app and we want to sort of check on if our records are actually patching to our data connection or patching to our entity correctly, we can go into data here and just see if those records are writing. And that's just another useful sort of tool that we have here. All right. So with that intro sort of done, let's go back to fields, because we probably want a couple more fields in here. Now, one of the things I said before is I'm a bit old school, and I do like having an ID field in my table that auto increments and sort of gives me this idea of having this unique ID for each record that I submit to my entity. And you get that out of the box with SharePoint lists. And, with very little setup, you also get that with SQL tables. So I want that in my team leave entity. So let's go ahead and create a field called ID. And that field type is going to be an auto number. So is it required? Yes. And will it be a string prefixed? Yep, but our prefix is going to be blank. And minimum numbers, number of digits will be 1. And our seed value will be 1. So we can see our preview here is showing us what it's going to look like, which is great. And this is pretty much what I exactly want. So every time I create a new record in my entity, my ID field is just going to increment. So like I said, this is kind of an old school way of thinking, but I just like to build my entities like this. And I always do this for my SQL tables as well. So let's do that here. Click done. So we can see here I've got an ID field and a name field. So let's just create I'm not going to get sort of bogged down in actually creating something real here. So I've called it team lead, but I don't really care what this entity does. I just want to show you how it actually works. So let's just go with let's just leave it at that. Hey, let's just leave it at that. We're just going to have an ID field and we're going to have a name field. Perfect. All right. So that's our entity. Cool. Like I said, this is going to be a super simple entity and it's really going to make no sense at all. But hey, if you watch my videos, you know that like a lot of my demos, like I do like this. I'm usually pretty lazy with how I set these things up. So yeah, I'm feeling pretty lazy right now. So I really just want to show you how these things work and sort of give you a really overview explanation of it. So I couldn't be bothered building like a full-on team lead entity right now, but hopefully you're getting the sort of message on this stuff is really sort of super simple. Like if I wanted to create another field, I could just, go in here, create a display name. This is where I define like the data type, and it's exactly the same way as how you would define a field in SharePoint where you select either text or it's a number field or a date field. So we've got those same things here. We've got text area, which is like a multi-line text field. We've got some of these other ones which are a little bit more specific, but you probably won't really use these most of the time as they will have sort of more rules around them. And I think a lot of the time they're not even really that relevant to when you're building Canvas apps. So probably a lot of these you don't need to bother so much with. Date and time, obviously, yep, or date only. This stuff is just making sense because it's exactly the same as a SharePoint list. Right, so out of there, let's click cancel because we decide we're not going to create any more columns in this particular entity. And let's just get straight into building an app that is going to use that entity. So let's go new app and create a Canvas app. And we just go tablet. Right. Again, super lazy approach here. So let's just go straight to data. And as we can see here, we've got our entities showing up. Let's just click on all entities. And one of the entities we can see right at the top here is team leave. And that's the one we just created. So let's click on that. And now we've got a data connection to our entity in CDS. So there's really all we need to do now is just go gallery. Oh, go to gallery. Connect it to team leave, and we're going to add some labels in here. That is in the gallery, right? So in here, we're going to show name, and we're also going to show ID. Well, let's show created on as well. That'd be pretty neat. That name created on. Borders around these so I can actually see them. And one more label. And it's already chosen our ID field for us. So that's great. Shrink that up. Make our gallery a bit shorter here. Okay, so this is our gallery now connected to our entity, which is really, as you can see, that was really super simple. So the next thing I want to quickly show you is how to save new records. And again, this is just another thing that is just crazy simple on how to do. So let's just insert another screen. And in here, I'm just going to have a label. Oh, yep, label. In that label, I'm going to be creating a new name and text input for that. And what was I think that's it. That's the only field that I added. Yeah, this is a pretty lame example, but again, it doesn't get any simpler than this. All right, let's create a button. Call that submit. Hey, look, I'm just gonna let's make this even simpler. Let's do this all on this home screen. Put a border around this guy as well, so we can see the gallery. All right, I'm not even going to have a separate screen for my submit data. So in here, unselect, want a patch, and our patch is going to be team leave. And this is just exactly how we do our name column. Going to come from text input 1. Text input 1, and we want the text value for that. Close that patch. Wow, this is truly a simple example. Right. And I guess the last thing we want to do is just reset text input 1. Okay, so let's give that a go. In here, I'm going to put any value, click submit, and there we go. We've saved a record to the CDS. Let's put something else in. Hi there. My name is Chino. And there we go. We've got 2 records now in. And if we go back to our entity and we find team leave. So this is our entity team leave, which we just connected to in our Power App. And we have just saved a couple of records to it. If we go down to data, we can see our records have been created. So if we go to, let me do one last thing, because this is just showing you how super simple this is. Let's create a view. Let's call this Chino view. It just shows you how absolutely easy this is to do. So in here, we've got, currently we're just showing the name field in this view, but we would also like to show ID. And we would like ID to be in front of name. And we want to sort by, now we want to actually sort by ID descending instead of ascending. Okay, let's click save on that. And we call that view Chino view. So the last thing I just need to do now is just publish that view. So now when I go back to Power Apps, all I need to do here is refresh my views. And in here, I can see Chino view. And there we go. I can select that view now inside of our gallery. And it's filtering exactly how I've configured that. So that's really as far as I really wanted to go today. For me, that even just finding out about entities and being able to sort of create list-like objects inside of the CDS and then save and retrieve data from them was a revelation to me. Like, for me, it was just taking a step into a brand new world, no longer thinking in terms of how am I going to build this application with a SharePoint list background, or even thinking at perhaps creating something in SQL. The CDS is far more accessible from a developer point of view, or from a Power Apps developer point of view, than say creating something in Azure and creating a SQL table in Azure or a SQL database in Azure, which tends to be more in the realms of, you know, your database administrator world, and far less accessible from sort of a business thinking and a business sort of idea that a developer will work directly with a SQL database. This is really something that developers have been asking for, having a sort of a sophisticated way to be able to handle data and work with data, but is something that is accessible and is at the sort of level of more at the application developer level. Yeah, it's great. And you know, I definitely recommend you take a look at it and think about building your next application using CDS, because it's really going to future-proof things for you and give you a lot of options moving forward.
Hey, hit the like button if you like this video, comment something in the comments section below, and of course subscribe to stay up to date with all my latest videos. I thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.